Hey guys, Roman here from techguides, and this is my updated Ultimate Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 and Warzone optimization guide. In this video, I'm going to show you the best settings in Warzone 2 and Modern Warfare 2 for the highest possible performance and best visibility. For this, I painstakingly benchmarked every single setting in the game, both on my primary system shown in blue on the left hand side, as well as on my secondary system shown on the right hand side in orange. Moreover, I show how every setting affects visual clarity in-game, such that you can decide yourself on the trade-off between higher visual fidelity versus higher performance. Besides the best in-game settings, I'm also going to talk about a few window settings that you want to change, as well as a few tweaks to the configuration file that actually make a measurable impact on in-game performance. Starting off in the display tab, we have display mode. Now on screen you can see the performance for both my primary system in blue as well as my secondary system in orange for both the full screen exclusive and the full screen borderless option. The dark blue and dark orange bars show the average FPS, whereas the light blue and light orange bars show the 1% lows. Performance-wise, there is absolutely no difference between full screen borderless and full screen exclusive. However, you should note that if you're playing the game in full screen borderless, you are adding 20 to maybe 50% input lag, so I would highly recommend anyone to stick to full screen exclusive. Under display adapter, make sure you are using your actual GPU instead of your integrated GPU. Refresh rate I have on auto, which matches my monitor's refresh rate, as is the case for display resolution. Now, if you need more performance, then I would highly recommend you to not use dynamic resolution and instead use one of the upscaler options in the quality tab. Leave the aspect ratio on automatic and disable VSync for both the gameplay and menus. The custom frame rate limiter has been shown by multiple sources to not work properly in Warzone 2, and therefore I would recommend to leave this disabled. Eco mode actually does not affect in-game performance, only the menus. And finally, for brightness, I use a value of 55. If you have an HDR monitor, obviously enable this here, and for anybody else, just leave it on automatic. Moving on to the quality tab, I recommend to use a render resolution of 100, because if you really struggle for performance, again, I would highly recommend you to use the upscaling filters instead of simply selecting a lower render resolution here. Note that I already produced a full video covering each and every one of these upscaling and sharpening filters in detail, which if you're interested you should definitely check out using the card in the top right hand corner. I personally still prefer to use Fidelity FX COS at a COS strength of 40%. However, if you need more performance, then using AMD FSR 2.1 at the quality preset is what I would recommend. The performance impact of the different anti-aliasing options for SMA 2x are shown on the right hand side. Increasing the anti-aliasing quality to normal does not affect performance whatsoever, whereas high and ultra quality both have a performance penalty of 2% respectively. When looking at a visual comparison, we can see that the low option is definitely extremely jaggy. One might actually say that there is no anti-aliasing going on in this option whatsoever, and the situation gets slightly better when moving up to normal. Comparatively, I don't really see any difference between the high and ultra preset, so if you want to use SMA 2x, then you might as well stick to the high preset. However, if you don't need every last ounce of performance out of your system, then I would generally recommend against using SMA 2x and use filmic SMA 2x instead, because this is the only way to get rid of these annoying grainy shadows when light hits a wall at a very steep angle. Performance-wise, both the low and normal filmic SMA preset have a 1 to 2% FPS penalty, whereas high and ultra both reduce performance by 4 to 5%. Visually, once again, the very low preset looks like there really is no anti-aliasing going on. Moving on to normal looks already much better, and high and ultra are basically indistinguishable. While the high preset definitely looks much smoother than normal, I would still recommend to use normal due to the less pronounced performance impact. Video memory scale traditionally was a very important option in order to reduce stuttering in Modern Warfare 2 and Warzone 2. However, according to my latest tests, I was no longer able to find these large stuttering intervals whenever I had video memory scale on a too high value. Now this is true for both my primary system, which has 16GB VRAM, as well as my secondary system, which only has 8GB VRAM in the 3060 Ti. On the other hand, I also couldn't observe any improvements in performance whenever increasing video memory scale, and therefore my recommendation would be to simply leave this at 60%. Before moving on, I'd like to mention that producing this video once again has been made possible by my friends over at Privado VPN. They are a Swiss registered company, which means that they have to abide to Swiss privacy laws. They have absolutely fantastic speeds on their VPNs. You can unlock pretty much any streaming service out there. And on top of that, it's even possible to use their service completely free of charge in their free tier. I have been using them for a couple of months now, and I definitely don't want to go back to any other VPN providers. So definitely check them out using the link in the description and get a phenomenal 77% off your yearly subscription. But without any further ado, let's move on to the quality tab. Texture resolution has a much higher impact on systems that are more CPU bound, as in the orange system on this graph, which has up to 10% performance penalty for the normal and high preset. On the other hand, a more GPU-bound system is only slightly affected by this option, and even the high preset only reduces performance by roughly 2%. On very low, all of the textures are obviously very low resolved, as the name suggests, and this is most notable for your gun skins that look absolutely horrible. This is already massively improved when only increasing this option to low. Finally, normal and high definitely look better than low, however the difference between normal and high is virtually indistinguishable. If you have a CPU-bound system, then my recommendation would be to use texture resolution low. On the other hand, if you're more GPU-bound, which is probably the case for most people watching this video, then playing at the texture resolution normal isn't going to introduce a huge FPS penalty, and your gun skins are going to look significantly better compared to low. Texture anisotropic filtering has virtually no effect on in-game performance, and if we look at this comparison, we can see that increasing this option makes textures that are viewed at an angle look much sharper. As this essentially does not impact performance, my recommendation would be to set this to high. Nearby level of detail once again does not significantly impact performance in Warzone 2, and honestly the visual difference is also negligible. Basically, the flower pot is a bit more round on the right hand side and the soul sack has less artifacts. On the other hand, distant level of detail does have a measurable impact on performance, and when looking at a side-by-side comparison, we can see that the differences are once again negligible. Essentially, the ivy is a little bit higher resolved, rocks have more textures, and this light fixture in the hallway is slightly better resolved on the right hand side. So once again, my recommendation is to leave this on low. For clutter draw distance, there are two options, short and long. However, there is also an option to further reduce this through a configuration tweak. And as you can see from the performance numbers, this option doesn't significantly affect performance, but reducing it even further through a config gives you an ever so slight FPS boost of 1 to 2 FPS. Definitely not the huge boost in performance as many YouTubers claim, but still better than nothing. I'll talk about how to modify this option later in the video. For particle quality and particle quality level, I have actually combined the performance metrics into one graph, and quite surprisingly, increasing the particle quality level to anything beyond very low significantly reduces performance in Modern Warfare 2 and Warzone 2. In fact, I'm seeing an extremely large drop in performance, especially of the 1% lows, when setting particle quality high, as well as particle quality level from low to high. Visually, we can see that this essentially affects the resolution of small particles. Essentially, they have a higher resolution on particle quality high. However, honestly, this is definitely not worth the hefty performance drop, and therefore I would highly recommend to always have particle quality low and particle quality level on very low. Bullet impacts, unsurprisingly, does not affect performance, and if you want to have the impact bullet holes on different surfaces or not is totally up to your personal preference. Persistent damage layers once again has no apparent effect on performance in-game, and honestly, because I also struggle to actually find a good side-by-side difference on how this option affects the visual quality of the game, I would recommend to just leave it disabled. Shader quality, on the other hand, has a quite significant impact on in-game performance, and we can see that increasing this option from low to medium or high comes with about a 5 to 10% performance penalty. As I already mentioned in my last video, you no longer need to increase this option from low to medium in order to have good quality golden camos. What this option mainly affects is the shadow quality, so kind of how spread out shadows are that are further away from objects. It looks a bit more realistic with medium and high, and it also affects how metallic surfaces appear in-game. Frankly, I don't think that either of these visual upgrades is worth the hefty FPS penalty, and therefore I recommend to leave it on low. Tesselation neither impacts in-game performance nor the visual quality of the game. On-demand texture streaming I would recommend to leave disabled in order to avoid the game to dynamically load in textures while you're playing the game. This option obviously also doesn't affect performance. Similarly, streaming quality has no apparent effect on performance in my tests, and on the other hand, I also showed in my previous video that setting streaming quality to low in fact improves visibility at a large distance. Volumetric quality significantly reduces in-game performance on both of the systems that I tested this on, and when looking at a side-by-side comparison, we can see that sun rays that hit particles are higher resolved on the higher options. However, in my opinion, this upgrade in visual fidelity is definitely nowhere near worth the hefty FPS penalty that this option comes with. Deferred physics quality apparently sets the physics quality of water, and honestly I have not been able to tell any difference whether or not I set deferred physics quality to off, low or high. On the other hand, we can see that this significantly reduces performance, and therefore I would recommend to leave it disabled. Finally, the water quality options only slightly decrease performance. However, because once again I was not able to tell any difference with either of these options, even if I had deferred physics quality on high, my recommendation would be to leave it on default. Increasing shadow map resolution doesn't significantly reduce performance in-game except for the extra quality, which has about a 6% FPS penalty, and when looking at a visual comparison, we can see that the very low option gives extremely grainy shadows. Low and normal look essentially identical and significantly improve the fidelity of the shadows from very low. The high preset once again produces much sharper and more defined shadows, and finally the extra preset adds additional shadows, such for instance here on the palm tree's trunk. In my opinion, there's not much point to go below normal, so that's what I would recommend you to use. Screen space shadows do not significantly impact performance in-game, however the shadows that they produce on your operator and on your weapon actually look completely horrible, and therefore I would recommend to leave this disabled. Spot shadow quality, as the name suggests, affects the shadow quality of spotlights, and the performance impact is essentially negligible. However, the shadows in-game look significantly better when increasing this option from low to medium. Further increasing this option to high can look good on some surfaces, however on other places this can introduce these huge, ugly, grainy looking walls of shadow, such that I would recommend to leave this set to medium. Setting spot cache to a higher preset historically has been shown to increase responsiveness of the game by increasing the 1% lows. This is no longer as pronounced as it was before the Season 5 Reloaded update, but my recommendation would still be to leave this set to the high preset. Particle lightning only has an insignificant impact on performance, and I also wasn't able to tell any difference in terms of the visual clarity of the game. Therefore my recommendation would be to set this to low. Ambient occlusion is set to actually add these soft shadows behind or underneath objects, and this significantly impacts performance as shown on screen right now. However, when retesting this, I simply wasn't able to find any comparison shot where this option actually affected the visual quality of the game, and therefore my clear recommendation is to leave this disabled. Screen space reflections only slightly reduce performance, however I wasn't able to find any comparison shots to show how this actually affects reflections in-game. Similarly, static reflection quality has no apparent impact on in-game performance nor the visual quality. Also, weather grid volumes only has a minor impact on performance, and I once again wasn't able to find any comparison shot to tell you how this actually works in-game. Finally, here are the performance numbers for Nvidia Reflex Low Latency, which I'm aware is a bit redundant because this only affects latency and not so much the performance of the game, and unfortunately I have no way to actually measure input latency, and thus my recommendation can only be regarding the performance, and the highest performance I observed on both of my system when enabling Nvidia Reflex Low Latency. Finally, you don't want to use depth of field, world motion blur, weapon motion blur, or film grain. And finally, in the View tab, we have Field of View. Now, the performance that you can see on this graph here are actually measured in a match of plunder, and therefore they're not exactly perfectly reproducible, but we can see that on my GPU-bounded system, the average FPS is essentially identical, however the 1% lows peak at around a Field of View of 100. On the other hand, the CPU-bounded system sees roughly identical performance up to a field of view of 90, after which the performance slightly decreases. However, these differences are likely down to sampling error, and therefore you shouldn't really try to improve your performance by selecting a lower or higher FOV. Just use whatever feels most natural for you to play at. In my case, I prefer to play at a field of view of 110. ADS field of view you want to have unaffected in order to avoid actually zooming into a standard field of view of 80. Weapon field of view you likely want to have on wide in order to reduce visual recoil. I'd recommend having third person field of view on 70 and vehicle field of view on wide. Finally, absolutely make sure to have the first person camera movement set to least. Now let's talk about a few of these configuration changes that I have already alluded to previously in this video. You can change the configuration by going to Documents, Call of Duty, Players, and opening the optionsfree.cod22.cst file. The first option that you want to modify is the Clutter max distance, which by setting the in-game value to short is set to 2500, whatever units this is. Now you can reduce this to 100 as the comment says here, and as mentioned before, this will gain you roughly 1 FPS performance. The second option that you definitely want to change is SunShadowCascades. Now on screen you can see a comparison of how this option actually affects in-game shadows, and as you can see, this actually makes the shadows look very low res, even on shadow map resolution normal. However, out of all of the different tweaks and modifications that you can do, this option probably gives you the highest boost in performance at 2 to 4%. So to change this, simply copy the text saying low 1 cascade, and you just gained a nice boost in performance. Finally, the RenderWorkerCount is another one of those important options that you definitely want to make sure to change according to your CPU. The way to figure out which is the correct value for you is to actually look up the specifications of your processor and to look for the number of actual cores that your CPU has. In case of the Alder Lake architecture, you want to look for the number of performance cores, and if you have one of the older architectures, like a 9th or 10th generation CPU, then you simply want to look at the number of total cores. Simply put this number in here and enjoy lag-free gameplay. Now that's not just something that I'm telling you, you can actually see the performance of the different options on screen right now. The blue CPU that I have is the 3900K, which actually should choose a number of 8 in the RenderWorkerCount, which results in the highest performance. On the other hand, my secondary system with the 7700K only has 4 cores, which therefore makes this the highest performing option in this test. As you can see, if you don't set this up properly, you can actually lose up to 10% performance in Warzone 2, so definitely make sure to have this set up properly. Onto a few more Windows settings. If we press on Start and type in Graphics Settings, we can find the Hardware Accelerated GPU Scheduling option. As you can see from my performance numbers, I would actually recommend to leave this disabled for Warzone 2. Next, you can also look for Game Mode, which will bring up the Game Mode settings. And as you can see from my performance benchmark, enabling the Game Mode ever so slightly improves performance in Warzone 2. Finally, here's another super important tip, and that is to actually check that your memory is running at its rated speed. So to do this, open up the Task Manager, go to Performance, go to Memory, and check what the speed says. So if this says 2133, then you know that your memory is actually not running at the rated speed that it should be running, or you just cheaped out on memory, that is. And if that's the case, then you should reboot your system, go into the BIOS and enable XMP. I have a dedicated short that deals with this topic linked in the card right now. Note that you could lose up to 10% performance if you don't have XMP enabled on your system. So in concluding, here are my recommended best settings for Warzone 2 and Modern Warfare 2. Display mode, full screen exclusive, all of these on their defaults, render resolution 100%, upscaling FX COS at 40%, or FSR 2.1 at quality, filmic SMA 2x at normal, 60% video memory scale, normal texture resolution unless you are severely CPU bound, in which case you want to select low, high anisotropic filtering, low LOD near and far, using the clutter distance as defined by the config file, particle quality low and the level on very low, bullet impacts I like to have enabled, shadow quality on low, tessellation off, on-demand texture streaming off, streaming quality, volumetric quality, deferred physics quality, and water quality on their lowest values, shadow map resolution normal, screen space shadow off, spot shadow quality medium, spot cache on high, and particle lighting, ambient occlusion, screen space reflections, static reflection quality, and weather grip volumes all on their lowest values. Finally, I found that Nvidia Reflex low latency gave me the highest performance on all my systems, but as I mentioned, I cannot measure input latency, and finally field of view of 110. Here's a few comparison shots how the game looks if you're running it at the lowest possible settings on the left and using my recommended settings on the right. So while only reducing performance by 1–2%, these settings make the game look absolutely phenomenal. Now, if you want to know what the best upscaling or sharpening filters are, then check out this video where I'm going through each and every filter, showing side-by-side comparisons and also how they each affect performance in-game. But with that, thank you guys so much for watching, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.